This story all starts back when I was about 6 or 7. I was always a quiet girl that liked spending a lot of time alone reading or playing. I had a lot of friends, but never spent much time with them outside of school, because my alone time was something that was always very important to me. After moving to a new city closer to some relatives that I didn't see much growing up, my aunt decided that it would be a great idea if I spent my after-school hours playing with her son, who's about 7 years older than me. My cousin was an odd kid. He never got on well with other people, and usually ended up being an outcast. He had no friends, and spent much of his time indoors watching TV or playing video games. He was prone to random fits of rage that usually ended with him breaking things or screaming a whole lot. He was also a lot bigger than most people his age, and was pretty huge compared to me. Around when we started hanging out, he was already about 6'4" and pretty overweight. He also had what I've come to call dead eyes. When he looks at you, it's like he's looking through you, and any emotion he showed never reached his eyes, other than anger. My aunt thought it would be beneficial for the both of us if we started spending our free time together so that he would have a friend, and I wouldn't be spending so much time alone. My parents weren't as enthusiastic about it, but thought that it wouldn't cause any harm. Everybody in the family always felt bad for my cousin, due to him always being alone and having parents that weren't exactly fit to be so. It was more like I was babysitting him more than anything, which looking back was a horrible situation to put a young girl in, with the guy so much older and bigger. It started out innocent enough. We shared some common interests, such as reading and video games, and he seemed not to be as violent to me, maybe because I was family. It's hard to say. It got to the point that we were talking or hanging out every day. People often mistook him for my older brother. When I got to be about 9 or 10, though, things started to change. By that time, he was 17, had been kicked out of school, and was regularly intimidating people. He was socially awkward to the point that I was the only person who he could have a conversation with, and he came to depend on my presence. I couldn't hang out with friends or ever have free time, or he would call up screaming and crying that I was betraying him or abandoning him. Then the threats started. I remember being in his apartment with him one day while his parents were out, and he was showing me a new knife that he had bought. For whatever reason, I was never afraid of him, even when he would have outbursts around me. It always seemed that I could calm him down, and I couldn't imagine that he would hurt me, as I was his only friend. It was this day that he laid down that we were going to run away from home when I turned 16, and that I was going to be his wife. Take care of him like a mother, basically, while he would spend his days playing video games. I sort of laughed it off, thinking it was a bizarre joke, or some sort of game he was playing. This made him really angry. He flew off the handle, started screaming and waving the knife around with the blade out, that we were meant for each other, and there was no way he would let me live if he couldn't have me. Being a naive idiot, I didn't tell my parents or his, and things started to get worse from there. If I tried to put off hanging out with him, he would threaten to kill my parents, or my cats, or his parents. He would come to my apartment late at night, knock on the door, then run off. I guess just to let me know he could. At the same time, he began doubling down on me being destined to be his lover. He would use his allowance to buy inappropriate clothing for me, or flowers. He would write poems and fanfics about our life together. He would call me in the middle of the night and try to get me to talk about inappropriate things with him. He also became very controlling. It got to the point that just going to school for the day would set him off, because it was less time he got to spend with me. I remember being about 14, and him killing his pet parrot in a fit of rage because I was late coming over to his apartment after school. It's cliché as hell, but he was screaming, "Look what you made me do," over and over, and then crying and hugging his parrot. It was one of the most terrifying things I've ever seen. He had a new parrot the next day. I can't remember how, but I ended up telling my parents about everything he was doing, and that I was afraid to ever be around him. They banned him from seeing me anymore, and told his aunt that he was scaring me and not to bring him to family get-togethers. I was honestly relieved and thought it would be over, that I could start living some sort of a life of my own without being tied to the hip to him. But then, the threatening phone calls, text messages, and social media messages started. He would either try to catfish me by pretending to be someone else, or he would straight up tell me that I was going to die soon, or my family was, that it was my fault for ruining his life. He sounded deranged. The way he would scream and scream, his all caps messages. I had to stop going out for walks because he started showing up and watching me. I honestly thought he was going to kill me. Every day was constant fear until I was 16 or so and got my first boyfriend. When he heard that I was with someone, I got my last message from him, saying I betrayed him in the worst way possible, and that one day, it could be weeks from now, or even years, he would kill me. Everything sort of died down after that. He never came to family gatherings again. He became a NEET and lives off his parents playing video games all day. He found someone else online that he started to stalk, which I guess took his focus off of me. My life went back to some sort of normal until I was about 21. Then I received a phone call from him asking me to help get his life back together, because according to him, the day I left his life was the day he lost all hope. I hung up on him immediately. It's been years now. He's in his mid-30s and is still a NEET. I still fear he'll come for me one day. I see him every once in a while, walking around where I now live. He looks terrifying. There's honestly so much more to the story that I've forgotten over the years. It's become such a blur due to a lot of other things that I was coping with around the same time. But I can say he made my life a nightmare for many years. Some of the more painful aspects of the story I can't even get into without throwing myself into a fit of anxiety. I hope to God that I never have to be in the same room as him again, because if that happens, I don't think I'll come out the other side alive. I was 16 years old. It was the middle of summer in Arizona, and I was spending the day at my boyfriend's house. It was probably around 11 a.m., and we were trying to figure out what we were going to do for the day. Something happened. I don't remember exactly what, but we ended up getting into a huge fight. It was pretty bad, and I was tired of fighting. I put on my shoes and grabbed my bag and left. He tried to chase after me to change my mind, but I refused. My best friend lived probably 3 miles away, and it wasn't too bad of a walk. Plus, it was the middle of the day, so I figured everything would be fine. I called my best friend and told her what had happened, and that I was coming over, and then I went on my merry way. As soon as I made it out of the parking lot of my boyfriend's apartment complex, I had this weird, awful sinking feeling in my gut. I brushed it off and figured it was just me being overwhelmed from the arguing. From where my boyfriend lived to my best friend's house, it was pretty much a straight shot down a main road, but there were always lots of people out and a lot of traffic. I had walked it 100 times before on my way to and from school, so I was comfortable and not really paying attention at all. I made it probably halfway to my friend's house, and just happened to look further up ahead on the same side of the street I was on. I saw a man in a small parking lot, standing beside a car. He seemed out of place to me. It was weird because I lived in a somewhat big city with all different types of people. He had dark sunglasses on, and was just surveying the road like he was searching for something. I remember thinking it was really strange. I made it to the next intersection and looked up ahead again, while waiting to cross the street. Again, there he was, the same side I was on, just standing around and looking towards the road. Something seemed really off, and I remember thinking that I didn't want to pass by him a second time, so I opted to cross the road in the other direction and not be on the same side of the street he was on. I crossed and was now walking on the left side of the road against the direction of traffic. Feeling a bit more cautious, I started to keep an eye on all my surroundings. The man was gone now, and I felt okay again. I was one street light away from where I needed to turn to get to my friend's house. She lived just a block off the main road. Suddenly, I hear footsteps behind me and I turn around. There was a man coming towards me, and it was him. He saw me look at him and started walking faster to catch up with me. He had a friendly smile on his face. He caught up with me fast and started to ask me directions to some place I've never heard of before. I told him that I didn't know and kept walking, hoping he'd say okay and leave me alone. He didn't. He stayed right next to me and kept asking questions. I was starting to panic and trying to think of what I should do next, but I felt like I was in a haze. I couldn't think straight, and I was getting more and more scared. I told him that he shouldn't be talking to me, because my dad was on his way to pick me up and my dad wouldn't like it. It sounded stupid, but it was the only thing that came to mind. The man told me that I was a liar, and that no one was coming for me. I kept insisting and telling him he needed to leave me alone. I should have just ran away at this point, but like I said, I literally couldn't think straight. All of a sudden he put his arm around me and draped it over my shoulders and said, "Let's go, now." I was in disbelief. Here's this stranger, this man who's putting his hands on me and trying to pull me with him. I felt like my heart was going to explode, but I was just walking with him. I couldn't do anything but just go along. He had turned me around, and we were now walking in the direction where traffic was going. Everything was in super slow motion. I remember looking down at the ground and watching my feet just walking, step after step, just walking with this stranger. He kept trying to talk to me, but it felt like I was underwater, and I couldn't really hear him or anything clearly. Finally, I looked ahead up the road and noticed where he was trying to take me. There was an abandoned house, almost completely surrounded by a tall brick wall. It felt like hours had passed, but it was only seconds. I felt almost like the blood was draining from my body. I started seeing flashes of myself, dead somewhere and thrown into a ditch. That was it. I finally snapped out of it. After being in this sort of trance, a thought finally came into my mind. My phone. I needed to get my phone. Luckily, my bag was on my right arm and he was on my left, so he didn't notice me slowly reaching in to grab it. It was a flip phone, so I was able to open up and find the call button, and tap it twice to redial the last person I had called, without ever having to take my hand out of the bag. I remembered that the last call I had made was to my best friend, when I was telling her I was coming over. Thank God. I knew she'd answer. I gave it a few seconds to ring and then just started screaming as loud as I could. I brought the phone up to my face and screamed help over and over. I felt a rush of tears stream down my face. He saw my phone and yanked it out of my hand, slamming it closed. I kept screaming anyway. He started yelling at me and cussing, and I remember him screaming at me to shut the fuck up. He put my phone away in his pocket and tightened his grip on me. He had one hand on each of my arms as he walked beside me. His fingers dug into them, and he pushed me, forcing me to walk with him. I remember shuffling around and trying to get away, but there was a lot of gravel in the sidewalk and I couldn't find good footing. He was still yelling and cussing at me, and I could smell alcohol all over his breath. It made me feel sick. This whole time there were cars driving by us, and I couldn't understand why no one was stopping to help me. We were getting closer to the house, and I remember thinking, I have to get away now. I stopped walking as abruptly as I could and dropped. I literally just bent down and jumped backward, slipping right out of his hands. I think it caught him off guard. I saw a glimpse of him look at me from under his arm, and he looked furious. I turned around immediately and started to run as fast as I could. I was so afraid that he was running after me. I ran directly into the road at oncoming traffic, hoping that he wouldn't follow me. I was hysterically screaming and crying and waving in my arms desperately at people to stop. Instead, they swerved out of the way. I remember seeing people's faces looking at me as they just drove past. No one was stopping, and no one would help me. I turned and looked behind me, but the man was nowhere in sight. I got back on the sidewalk and kept running in the direction I was going. I came to a side street. There was a silver van stopped in the middle of the road, with a younger woman flagging me down and asking if I was okay. I ran up to her, telling her someone had tried to kidnap me. She handed me her phone to call the police, and told me that it was okay now and that she would wait with me. Another car pulled up behind hers, a white work truck filled with tools. Two men jumped out of the truck and ran over to see what was wrong. The woman explained what had happened while I was still on the phone with the police. They were older Hispanic men that didn't seem to speak English very well, but they understood what she had told them. One of the men ran back to the truck and brought me some of his Big Gulp to drink. It was a watered-down Pepsi, but it was so hot out, and my throat had hurt from screaming. I drank it and thought about how refreshing it was. The other man asked me what the kidnapper looked like. I described to them what the man had looked like and what he was wearing, and without another beat they jumped back into their truck to drive around and track him down. Finally, a police officer arrived, and I thanked the woman who had stayed with me. I walked over to the officer and explained what had happened while she drove off. After I told him everything, he told me I shouldn't have dressed so revealing and it probably wouldn't have happened. I was wearing a regular tank top and long leggings. It was 110 degrees out that day. He gave me his cell phone so I could call my mom to come pick me up. She answered and I told her what happened. She was 45 minutes away across town at work, and I think those 45 minutes were some of the worst of her life, because she didn't know exactly what had happened or if I was okay. The police officer then offered to take me to my friend's house, which was only a minute or two away while we waited for my mom to get there. I ran up and knocked on her door crying, and had a police officer with me, so when she opened the door, I couldn't understand why she looked so confused. I had called her and screamed for help, so surely she knew something was wrong, and had called and told someone I needed help. No. She answered the phone and heard me crying for help and thought nothing of it and went about her day. Not sure why that didn't bother me more than it did back then. Finally, my mom got there, and I started crying again as soon as I saw her. I thought I'd never see her again. I hugged her and just cried even more. She talked to the officer who had dropped me off. He had only filed a police report, and wouldn't even attempt to look for the man who had just tried to kidnap me, because too much time had passed and he would be long gone by now. He had sent another officer to the scene of where everything had happened to try and find any evidence. He found my phone thrown beside the brick wall near the house. They then fingerprinted it, but all of the prints were too smudged to be of use. And that was that. The police went on their way and never gave it another thought. It's been 10 years since then, but I still think about it a lot. I always make sure all my doors are locked, and I never really go anywhere alone. I have trouble just walking to the mailbox sometimes. I get scared getting out of my car to put gas in it if there are men around. I have to have my husband leave work to come home and be with me if there's ever any normal appointments at our home, like the maintenance man having to come inside to fix something, and I instantly panic if I lose sight of him at the store while we're out. I still cry about it sometimes. I can't even really remember anymore what the man's face looked like, but I'm still plagued by him to this day, and I hope I never have to meet him again. I saw another post about a school bus, and it reminded me of this incident when I was very young. My bus route was long, anywhere between 1 to 2 hours, and I was one of the last stops. It was on a really rural route, with lots of mountains, dirt roads, and holloways. Being a rural area, most of these hollows were long, windy roads that families and relatives lived on. Normally just 1 or 2 families of kids being dropped off at the same points. This meant that if a particular family of kids didn't ride the bus that day for whatever reason, that the bus driver could skip that hollow and save us anywhere from 5 to 30 minutes off the total route. How could this ever be a bad thing, right? But one particular hollow, about 5 miles long, had only 2 stops for 2 different families. The second family lived at the furthest point down the road. It was easily 3 to 4 miles past the first family's drop-off point, down a crooked, dead-end, single-lane dirt road. It was the worst part of the route each time. Now on days the second family didn't ride the bus, if the driver skipped driving all the way to the second family's house, then it would save a 20-minute round trip, not to mention the stress of driving on the claustrophobic dirt road in a huge hulking school bus. There were also times the family waited to pick up the kids in their own car at the first drop-off, to save the bus a bit of time and spare it the experience of driving down that road. So of course, whenever they could, the driver would turn around at the first family's drop-off point. However, this was not as smooth a turn as going the full way to the second family's house. This drop-off point was a small circular area, with a couple of different driveways spiraling off of it, only one of which was large enough for a school bus to fit, and definitely not big enough for a bus to do a 360 turn in one swoop. With the help of the larger driveway, though, a 3-point turn could get us out of there easy peasy. At most, the bus needed 2 meters of this driveway space and hardly 30 seconds of its time. We did this happily for as long as I can remember, until either new residents moved in, or the existing residents of the trailer in this driveway about 20 meters away lost their minds. Suddenly, there's a large red farm gate at the extreme end of the driveway. No possible way for the bus to turn around when closed. For the first few months, whenever we could cut this route short by turning there, the driver would stop the bus during the 3-point turn, open the gate, barely reverse into the driveway, pull out, stop the bus again, close it, and carry on, saving us all 20 minutes of needless driving. Keep in mind this only happened when the second family either did not ride the bus or was being picked up, so not very often at all. Then one day we turn up and there's now a lock on the gate. So we drive the 20 minutes and just carry on. Still, each time we have a chance to do the turn, the driver would check if it was unlocked. I don't know if it was ever requested to leave it unlocked, but I know from the driver's reactions they wanted it to be. So if it did happen to be, we would take the shortcut and the driver would put the gate back as it was. To my knowledge, no one ever complained about this. Then comes the day of the trap. We get to the first drop-off. The second family was not riding the bus. Nothing looks amiss, except, hey, what do you know? The gate is open. I can remember the smile on the driver's face as she puts the bus in reverse and begins to turn. At this point in the ride, it's just myself and 3 to 4 other kids, only one being a grade above me, and I was barely 6 years old. Of course, I was chattering away with my friend, and didn't notice that we had stopped. Once I did start to look around, however, to my confusion, there were an assortment of ATVs, 4-wheelers, side-by-sides, and the like, and actual cars that had pulled out of the side driveways to surround the bus in every single direction. To make it more confusing, and thinking back, horrific, they all had an assortment of firearms. Yes, real guns. Now I'm 6, and I grew up around guns. I wasn't scared by what I saw, but I also didn't realize we were being held hostage. All I remember is the feeling of profound confusion, not being able to work out why we were sitting there, what these people were doing and why the other kids were crying. Maybe I was blissfully ignorant, but the driver told us to play on the floor and not look out the windows. Me being me, I propped my jacket up over the window in my seat and told everyone we could play under my row. I ended up having a great, albeit slightly boring time waiting. It went on for what felt like hours, and I never looked out the windows during it, but I'm sure it was really only an hour at most, give or take. Our parents slowly started showing up looking for us. I remember 2 kids being allowed out before me. Then, as I was growing truly bored, my grandfather showed up to save me, too. He came onto the bus, spoke to the driver, and held my hand as he walked me back to his truck. No one else saying a word except my cheery goodbye to the driver. I remember all of the gang just staring her down as I walked away, and she never moved from her seat the entire ordeal. I didn't know what happened after I left. It was only later that I grew up to realize the severity of the event. I know for sure my grandfather and parents called the school system, but I never heard of any punishment or follow-up. The gate was never left open again, and we still had to drive that route each day, always driving it all the way through. Except, of course, for those blissful days both family of kids didn't ride and we could skip it altogether. The same bus driver stayed on the route. She was honestly an angel to remain so calm and collected throughout.